My name is Jacob Rorm. I'm one of the Public Programs Associates here, and we are excited to share with you today our program, Minnesota Connections, the World War II Military Intelligence Service Language School and the building of a Japanese American community. The program is made possible thanks to the Japanese American Citizens League and the Marnie and Conley Brooks Fund. I'd also like to remind you that we all come today to today's conversation from communities that owe their existence and vitality to generations past from all around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energies to our collective past. Some of them were brought here against their will. Some immigrated here in hopes of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. And here in the land we call Minnesota, it is also the ancestral and contemporary homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We gather today on the lands of the Dakota here at the Minnesota History Center. We invite you to consider your relationship to this land and the many different legacies that have brought us together today here. And this afternoon, we're going to be discussing the Military Intelligence Service Language School, which moved to Minnesota in 1942, first to Camp Savage and then to Fort Snelling, and you'll learn more about that. And we're going to be guided in this discussion by Kimmy Tanaka, who's the program supervisor at Historic Fort Snelling at Bdote and member of the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League Education Committee. We're also joined by the descendants of some of the graduates of the language school, Matt Abe, Peggy Doi, and Karen Tanaka Lucas. So I'd like to have you join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Thank you, Jacob. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be a moderator for this event. It is an honor to be here with all of our panelists and to have this opportunity to share with you the history of the Military Intelligence Service Language School. As Jacob mentioned, my name is Kimmy Tanaka, and I am a program supervisor at Historic Fort Snelling. I would like to start by introducing a little bit about the history of the Military Intelligence Language School. In total, about 33,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry served in the U.S. military during World War II. They served in three main units. The first was the 100th Infantry Battalion, made up of draftees from Hawaii, pictured here in Italy. The 100th eventually became part of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, pictured here also in Italy. The 442nd became the most decorated unit of its size in U.S. military history. And perhaps lesser known than those two units is the Military Intelligence Service. And in total, about 6,000 Nisei or second generation Japanese Americans graduated from the MISLS. So for most of its existence during World War II, the school was located here in Minnesota. This photo is of Company G of the MIS on the parade grounds of the Fort Snelling Upper Post. So why was the school here in Minnesota? About a month before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the 4th Army Intelligence School, as it was called then, opened at the Presidio in San Francisco on the West Coast, as you see on the map there. After the attack on Pearl Harbor and in February of 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the military to designate the military exclusion zone on the West Coast. That's noted in red on the map. About 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were forcibly removed from this area and then eventually placed into 10 permanent government-run War Relocation Authority concentration camps, as noted in the yellow dots on the map. So meanwhile, in early spring of 1942, the commanding officer of the school, Colonel Kai Rasmussen, pictured here on the left, began his search for a new location for the school outside of that exclusion zone. In his search, he visited the 7th Corps area, which included the state of Minnesota. This is where he met Harold Stassen, the governor of Minnesota at the time, pictured here on the right. Stassen suggested a former Civilian Conservation Corps camp in Savage, Minnesota. Later on in 1945, Rasmussen stated that he selected Minnesota because the location had to not only have room physically, but room in the people's hearts. In the early summer of 1942, the first class at Camp Savage started under the new name, Military Intelligence Service Language School. And today, Camp Savage, or where Camp Savage was, is noted with a marker, and there is an exhibit at the Savage Library. And we have in the audience today, Mayor of Savage, I just wanted to call that out, Janet Williams is here with us. And so at Camp Savage, more and more soldiers were recruited, many of them from behind barbed wire in the concentration camps. And then the school needed more space, so then it moved to Fort Snelling in 1944, where all of the soldiers could be accommodated. The school was at Fort Snelling from 1944 to 1946. So in just those 2 years, it trained almost 4,000 Nisei, men and women, to work as linguists for the war effort. We have on the photo on the left side, right in the front row in the center is Kai Rasmussen, and it's a photo with both the men and women. On the photo on the right side is one of the, at least part of the first group of women from the Women's Army Corps. The woman on the far right on the second row, her name is Sue Ogata Kato, and the picture, both of the photos are from her scrapbook that she kept. In about 6 to 9 intense months, they were trained in the Japanese language with an emphasis on military terminology, map reading, radio monitoring, and interrogation techniques. Following training, many were deployed overseas to work as linguists, primarily to the Pacific Theater and to support the occupation forces in Japan. Towards the end of the school's time at Fort Snelling, there were 5,000 graduates overseas with 130 different units. They were attached to various branches of the U.S. forces, as well as other allied armies. They served in every combat theater and in every major battle against the Japanese military forces. On October 22nd, 1945, Kai Rasmussen held a press conference at Fort Snelling applauding the work of the MIS. The War Department's press release of that conference stated that never before in history did one army know so much concerning its enemy prior to actual engagement as did the American Army during most of the Pacific Campaign. Shortly before the schools moved back to California, an illustrated school album was published. In it, it further stated, information obtained by the MIS cannot be measured in words, but by the weight of victory itself. So next, I'd like to introduce our panelists who will be sharing the stories of their fathers who served in the Military Intelligence Service. But before I introduce the first panelist, I did want to also acknowledge one of our MIS veterans who is in our audience today, Edwin Bud Nakasone. He's a retired history professor from Century College in White Bear Lake, and he's also the father of Paul Nakasone, who is a 4-star general of the U.S. Army Cybersecurity. Bud, I know you're moving on us. You were up there earlier, and now you're down here, but thank you, Bud Nakasone, for always coming and supporting our events and for sharing your stories with us and for your service. For our first panelist, I do have the pleasure of sharing the same last name, although we are not related. And I think we have both explained to many people in the past that Tanaka is like a Smith or an Anderson, so it's very common. Karen Tanaka Lucas is a third-generation Japanese American born in occupied Japan. where her father was stationed with the Military Intelligence Service. She considers herself a native Californian and received her bachelor's degree from Stanford University. But since attending graduate school, medical school, and residency at the University of Minnesota, she's been a Minnesotan now for over 50 years. She retired after 31 years as a family physician with Health Partners. After many years working in Asian American community building and advocacy groups, she has been volunteering as a board member with the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League, and more recently with the Exhibits Advisory Group to the Minnesota Historical Society for the revitalization of Historic Fort Snelling. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Karen Tanaka Lucas to share the story about her father, Walter Tanaka.
Well, I don't know about you guys, but this feels really weird because this is the first time in 2.5 years I've worn a dress. So this is my father on the, well, I guess the little red clicker is not going to work, so I'll just describe it. My dad on the far left, that's me in front center. Let's see if we can. This Camp Savage plaque is the only thing that remains on the 132-acre site in Savage, Minnesota, of the Military Intelligence Service Language School, the MISLS. And in part, it reads, according to General Charles Willoughby, Chief of Intelligence to General Douglas MacArthur, the 6,000 Nisei shortened the war in the Pacific by 2 years. When I moved to Minnesota, this school was still a classified military secret, and I had no idea that my father had ever been here. This plaque was not to be erected for another 23 years. It's been a 50-year journey for me to be able to share his story with you. This is a picture of my dad on the farm in San Luis Obispo, which is a small town, southern coast of California. He's standing next to his father, who is on his right, and then his 2 younger brothers on his left. So my dad was drafted in June of 1941, which was 6 months before Pearl Harbor, before the war with Japan started. And the small town, the Japanese American community, had a proud banquet and a big send-off for the 3 Nisei young men who had been drafted, because in this act of drafting them, their countries signaled to them that they were wanted and accepted, unlike their immigrant fathers who could never become American citizens. This is a picture of my dad in basic training at Camp Roberts. And my dad said there was nothing unusual or different about the way that the Nisei were treated. He was just one of the boys. He was assigned to infantry heavy weapons. And when he was done with basic training, he then went to Fort Ord to join a combat unit. These are pictures of my dad. One, he's got the ammunition belts around his neck. The other, he's working a machine gun. The week after Pearl Harbor, Dad was manning a machine gun on a beach north of San Francisco. There were about 5,000 Nisei in the U.S. Army before the war with Japan started. Many of them were summarily discharged for no reason. The rest were disarmed, like my dad had his rifle taken away from him, and they were sent inland and attached to labor battalions, often doing the work formerly assigned to prisoners. So my father was shoveling coal into the furnaces to keep the barracks warm in the middle of the night at Fort Custer, Michigan, until a team of Army linguists came by testing soldiers, especially the Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American soldiers, for Japanese language proficiency. And my dad passed the test and was selected for the language school. When my dad was at Fort Custer, he was sending postcards home, and this is a postcard he sent to his 16-year-old sister. But you'll notice, I don't know if you can read it, but the family address is no longer San Luis Obispo, Southern California. Instead, it is now Cutler, California, because what the family had done is they had quickly moved inland to try to escape the military exclusion zone where they were rounding up and incarcerating people. So they moved to Cutler, California, where he had a friend who had a farm, and they were living in a tank house and working in Cutler. The next postcard my dad sends his little sister, she has a different address, and the address on this card is Camp 3, Poston, Arizona. This was one of the 10 American concentration camps. The family had been rounded up because suddenly the military exclusion zone had been expanded to include the entire state of California for no good explanatory reason, and they were rounded up and put in one of the concentration camps where most of the family stayed for 3.5 years on a reservation in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. So my dad was, he was in the first class of 200 soldiers who were selected for Camp Savage. 160 of those 200 soldiers were Nisei. This is my dad at Camp Savage. But what was actually surprising is that 90% of the Nisei soldiers who were tested did not pass the Japanese language proficiency test because they had been born here. They were raised with playmates and classmates and teachers who all spoke English, and they were too Americanized. But during the Depression, my dad had to be pulled out of school to work on the farm. So starting in 8th grade, for 4 years, he was kept at home as a farm worker with the family. And he graduated 4 years late, but in those 4 years, he got kind of a form of language immersion homeschooling. And his mother was an educated city girl from Japan who spoke the high standard form of Japanese, which gave him an advantage. This is a morning roll call at Camp Savage. The course was based on a 3-year curriculum that was condensed down into 6 months. They were memorizing 50 of those complex kanji characters every day. And due to the complexities and the rigors of the subject, my dad was one of the many soldiers who stayed up in the latrines studying flashcards at night because it was the only place where lights were left on after 11 o'clock. This is a picture of one of the regular hikes they took around Savage. And as the demand for Nisei linguists increased because they had proved their worth in places like Guadalcanal and Solomon Islands, as the demand increased and they could no longer cull any more qualified Nisei from the enlisted men's ranks, they started recruiting from Hawaii and from inside the concentration camps. And then in the end of 1943, they actually started drafting men out of the concentration camps. This is a picture of my dad. He's on the left in November 1942 at Camp Savage, just before he graduated. After graduation, Dad was on one of 2 10-man air technical intelligence teams, and he was sent to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, where he got additional specialized training with the Army Air Corps. This is my dad in Australia. He got shipped out to Australia. He worked with Allied officers, so this is like, British, Dutch, Indonesian, because they didn't have their own linguists, so they used ours. He worked with Allied officers in interrogating captured air prisoners of war in Australia, New Guinea, and the Philippines. So my dad is on the left there. He was working with ATIS, which stands for Allied Translator Interpreter Section in Brisbane. Now, ATIS was MacArthur's center in the South Pacific for the translation of all captured and intercepted communication from the Japanese and interrogation of prisoners. At the height of operations in 1945, ATIS employed 4,000 linguists, the vast majority of whom were trained here in Minnesota at Camp Savage and at Fort Snelling. ATIS interrogated 14,000 captured prisoners and translated 2 million documents. This is my dad, who also, and he's kneeling on the left. This is him in New Guinea when he was stationed with what's called advanced ATIS. And what advanced ATIS were linguists who were embedded further afield and on the front lines. He's here examining some downed Japanese aircraft parts. He was involved in the early investigation of what the Japanese called the Oka bomb, when a prisoner revealed that the Japanese were shipping these to their forward bases to be carried by special attack units of suicide pilots. And these were a form of kamikaze attacks. Another objective that my dad had was pinpointing strategic sites in Japan and the location of critical war materials, factories, and storage in order for them to become targets of U.S. B-29 raids. Towards the end of the war, my dad was promoted and assigned a 10-man team of Nisei linguists, and they flew with an advanced echelon of high-ranking Army officers on a plane that landed in Japan on the first day of the occupation, hours before MacArthur's plane. Within the year, he took command of the 166th Language Detachment. And he eventually became the executive officer of the 168th Language Detachment, where one of the men under his command was none other than our own Bud Nakasone, who is right in the center of the picture. My dad is on the far left. This is a picture of my dad during the 5 years he spent in the occupation of Japan. He also worked in counterintelligence in the 1950s for 3 years, and he was in Korea in the early 1960s. But a lot of his work might have been kind of routine. He called it mundane, but some of the things, the memorable things that he recounted was early on participating in meetings with the heads of the Japanese army in disarming and demobilization of the Japanese military. He also was on a visit to General Masaharu Homma, who was the general in charge of the Bataan Death March before Homma was sent from Omori prison to the Philippines to be tried and executed for war crimes. Dad also had the opportunity to interview General Hideki Tojo, who was the Japanese wartime prime minister, on several occasions. Early on, it was mostly welfare checks. Tojo was hospitalized because he attempted suicide and didn't succeed, so he was in a U.S. military hospital. Dad also would be present when Japanese cabinet ministers would go and visit Tojo in the hospital. And then when Tojo was finally ready, well enough to be discharged, my dad was sent to investigate why he had no clothes, why his clothing couldn't be found. And on questioning Tojo said to him, Turned out the guards who were guarding his room had asked for pieces of his uniform for souvenirs, and he obliged them by giving them and even autographing some of them. But he told my dad, "Don't be hard on these boys. They didn't do anything wrong. These were given to them." So my dad then had the job of arranging to have a new uniform made for Tojo, which I presume was the one he wore at his war crimes trial. This is a newspaper article from Stars and Stripes paper for military personnel. And this article is from 1945. And the gentleman, the soldier, Nisei soldier on your left, is Isamu Saito, who's a 1944 graduate of Fort Snelling, MISLS. And he later on became a resident of Roseville. He was featured in this article about the devastated people in Japan after the defeat of war. Millions of them were homeless when you consider that something like 66 of all their major cities were bombed, some to smithereens, some just really badly destroyed all their infrastructure. So millions were homeless, and as many as 10 million starved to death in the fall and winter of 1945 as Japan slowly started to rebuild and recover from war. But Nakasone writes in his book, The Nisei Soldier, when the occupation force arrived, MIS linguists who treated them with understanding and kindness first met the Japanese. Their fear turned to relief, antagonism to cooperation, suspicion to friendliness. This situation paved the way for a level of success of the occupation that was unprecedented in the annals of human history and led to the lasting peace and friendship between the United States and Japan that we still enjoy today.
Thank you, Karen, so much for sharing the story of your father. I feel like I learn something new each time I hear that story. So, our next panelist, Matt Abe, was born and raised and has lived and worked in the Twin Cities metropolitan area in Minnesota his entire life. He graduated from the University of Minnesota with a degree in scientific and technical communication. Matt has worked his entire career as a technical writer and technical publications manager for international high-tech companies. He is currently the information architect at the Minneapolis manufacturer of fluid handling systems, Graco Incorporated. He is also the current scoutmaster of a Scouts BSA troop in Plymouth, Minnesota, and an active member of Toastmasters International. Matt is a former board member of the Twin Cities chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League, and while in high school, the JACL's Japanese American Youth Organization. Growing up, Matt got to know many of his parents' friends, including veterans of the Military Intelligence Service and the all-Japanese American 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. He has shared the story and wartime memories of his father, Toshio Bill Abe, to be featured in the new Plank Museum and Visitor Center at Historic Fort Snelling, coming in spring of 2023. So now it is my pleasure to welcome Matt Abe to share the story of his father, Toshio William Abe.
Good afternoon. Thanks for being here today, everybody. I'd like to start off with an unexpected pleasure of thanking Bud Nakasone for his excellent research into the history of the Nisei in the U.S. military. Bud has interviewed my dad a couple times, and I relied on Bud's books and research for much of my remarks today. As many of his generation who fought during World War II, my dad didn't really share much about what he did
in the military with us kids growing up. One of the reasons may be that the very existence of the MISLS was classified until the early 1970s. And so that was one reason that we, in his family, but also members of the general public, never heard about the MISLS. So I'm very pleased to be here today to share that history with you. My dad, Toshio William Abe, was born in San Diego, California on June 27, 1919. He grew up the son of Japanese immigrants. His father started a fishing business in San Diego that eventually grew into a very large concern with an entire fleet of ocean-going fishing boats. So it was a very going concern. He hired many experienced Japanese nationals who were experienced in fishing on the ocean, and he had quite a crew working for him. Growing up, my dad was kind of the all-American guy. His dad would always tell him, and my dad said that his friends heard the same thing from their fathers. His dad said, "You guys are Americans. That's where your feelings should be. That's where your heart should be." And so my dad, I'm proud to say, was in the Boy Scouts. He was an Eagle Scout. He also enjoyed downhill skiing, going up to the mountains to ski. He enjoyed photography and working on the family cars. In January of 1941, my dad's dad passed away, and so my grandmother was newly widowed, and my dad was in college at the time, but he left college to help take care of his mother. In April of 1941, he was drafted by the U.S. Army. He sought a deferment because his mother had just died, but that deferment was denied. So my dad decided to join the Army Medical Corps, and that's where he was serving on December 7th of 1941 when Pearl Harbor was attacked. In the spring of 42, like Karen's dad, my dad was on hard labor, except he was at Camp Walters in Texas, and the Military Intelligence Service was looking for linguists, and my dad was one of 20 who passed that test that Karen, your dad, took. And so he was shipped up to Minnesota. They had no idea at the time where they were headed, but they ended up in Minnesota, Camp Savage, at a home that was a former Civilian Conservation Corps camp, and you saw a picture of that Karen showed. They were just log cabins. My dad said after the CCC was in there, that it was used for homeless men. And if my dad was alive today, knowing his sense of humor, he would have said it wasn't good enough for the homeless men, so they put us there. One of their first jobs was to get the camp ready for, to be a military camp and a language school. In May and so he arrived in May. The thing that he did share with us, kids growing up, is that he experienced very little overt racism in San Diego, but he did say that there was a definite separation from the majority culture. In contrast, when he arrived in the Twin Cities and he and his buddies would go into downtown Minneapolis to the USO on Liberty over the weekend, he noticed that people had a very different attitude in Minneapolis. They were much more friendly and pleasant to us. They saw us in uniform, and at first they were a little bit confused about whether they were POWs or why they were even in Minneapolis. But he had a very good experience in the Twin Cities. He graduated with that first class of linguists in December of 1942, but he did not receive his overseas orders until about a year later. So in the meantime, he stayed in Savage and actually re-enrolled in that 6-month course. So he actually went through the course twice. The reason that he was not issued overseas orders immediately is because he was perceived as a security risk. They did a review and discovered that his dad had employed many Japanese nationals in his fishing business that grew during the 1930s, and so that was kind of looked on with some suspicion. They also discovered that my dad, who was an engineering student, had taken in 1937 some pictures of the Oakland Bay Bridge being constructed. And so that was critical infrastructure, and that was looked on with some suspicion. So my dad repeatedly protested or filed complaints about that deferment, and he finally did get his overseas orders in December of 43. So there we go. So here's Dad at the post office in Savage. When my dad first was shipped overseas, he landed eventually, this was actually on a merchant marine ship, so it took him a while to get there, but he eventually landed in New Delhi, India, and he spent several months translating documents. However, before long, Dad was assigned to various combat units. And the one thing that he wanted everybody to recognize, and he mentioned this in several interviews, is that they were in combat situations just about 100% of the time. He carried a .45 caliber pistol and a carbine rifle, and the impression, my dad said, that most people have of us in intelligence is that you sit in an office and translate this and that. But that's just part of the war. Most of the real work is out there in the field. And so Dad was involved with translating, being an interpreter for captured prisoners and that type of work, but often they were shooting at him and he was firing back. So he was eventually recommended for but never received the combat infantryman badge. And I guess many in Issei had that same experience where they were out on the front lines but they never received that award. After the war, Dad graduated. He went to the University of Minnesota, as did I, and as did my son. We were all Golden Gophers. He graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering, and he worked as a mechanical engineer in consulting firms, and eventually went to work at 3M, which is where he was working when he retired in 1991. Dad gave many presentations and interviews about his wartime experience, and for that I'm very grateful because, again, I never would have heard half of these stories had he not done that. And Dad passed away in April of 2004. My dad would be very pleased, proud, and humbled that the MISLS is being remembered in such a meaningful way today and very soon at Historic Fort Snelling. I'd like to thank the Minnesota Historical Society for conducting today's program and for allowing me to participate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Our third and final panelist, Peggy Doi, who shares a name with her mother, is the oldest of Bill and Peggy Doi's 5 children. She was born and grew up in Minneapolis and received a Bachelor of Science degree in medical technology from the University of Minnesota. She worked primarily in pharmaceutical research and public health. She retired and moved back to the Twin Cities in 2009 to care for her parents. Currently, she is very active with the Minnesota Nikkei Project, a nonprofit service group to aging Japanese in the Twin Cities area, a group that was spearheaded by her father in 1978. She's a member of the Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League Education Committee and the Parish Social Justice Committee. She also sits on the RASP, the Roseville Area Senior Program Advisory Council, and Corpus Christi Parochial Council. She's also one of the volunteer directors for the nonprofit gift shop at the Anpetu Techa Education Center. Now, last but not least, it's my pleasure to welcome Peggy Doi to share the story of her father, Saburo Bill Doi.
Hello, everybody. Let's see. Now, my father, in experience with the MISLS, was quite different from the others that you've heard on this program, or actually in the program at all. in that my father never was sent overseas as a linguist. However, he provided what was needed to all of the soldiers at Camp Savage and Fort Snelling during their time at the language school. As a little background, my father, Saburo Bill Doi, known mostly as Bill, was born August 31st of 1916 in the Bothell-Woodinville area of Washington State, outside of Seattle. His father raised the 4 children on his own after the death of his wife in 1924, when Dad was 8. His father had worked on the railroad up until his wife's death, but started to farm after that to be near the children. When Executive Order 9066 was issued, Dad and his family were first sent to the Pinedale Assembly Center, a racetrack near Fresno, California, and then to Tule Lake. It was incarcerated in Tule Lake in Northern California. While he was at Tule Lake, a recruiter came to Tule Lake to recruit people for the MISLS. Let's see. The recruiter was Stamy Kumagai, who was a Nisei, and actually he and his family lived in Minnesota after the war. There were 34 young men from Tule Lake who felt that had the proficiency in the Japanese language to be recruited. They called themselves the Tulians. Dad said that he thought the proficiency level was set pretty low. One interesting story, on the train ride from Tule Lake to Minnesota, there were a number of comments made about the Japanese on the train. And Stamy Kumagai was in uniform. The Tulians, of course, were not. But Stamy stood up and said, "These young men are Americans and in the U.S. Army and should be respected." That made an impression on my dad. He knew he was in the Army. Once they arrived here, dressed for California, they were transported in open trucks from the train station to Camp Savage in November of 1942. Needless to say, that made an impression too. My father started out with his class. However, 2 months into that intensive 6-month program, somebody in camp was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and so they x-rayed everybody. They found a spot on Dad's lung and decided it was active disease, and so he was in isolation for 2 months before they determined it was not active disease. Let's see. He was actually in the second to the lowest class when he was there, so there was no way he could catch up. He volunteered to be sent to basic training for the infantry, but he was told that he could join the next language class. And in the meantime, he was assigned to special services, actually a position that he was well suited for because he was very organized and a mover. And actually a place that he ended up staying the entire time. He was never able to join a language class. They kept him there. The position started out with just 2 people and ended up finally with 10. The primary duty of this position was to raise the morale of the soldiers studying. With long class hours and little downtime, the morale was definitely a problem, which was hard on the young men and made it difficult to learn. Later, Dad said that the move from Camp Savage to Fort Snelling was in itself a morale booster, since the facilities at the fort were so much nicer than at the camp. This is a picture of my father. He's seated in the middle with the people he was working with at that time. I've also included a graphic of sort of the controversial mascot, the gopher, and these graphics were actually done by a Nisei who was a graphic artist for Disney before he was recruited. There were a number of things that they set up, athletics and social and other cultural kinds of things. that were set up by the special services. Dances were actually one of the highlights of the activities. And Dad, when they first had him at Camp Savage, they found a barn and they cleaned it out so that they could actually have people there. And he worked with the WWII to have women who volunteered to come in and return in buses for the dances. Let's see. Later when they came to Fort Snelling, they were actually in the field house, which was a much nicer and larger place. There were lots of team sports, softball, baseball, broom hockey, and many other sports, anything almost that you could think of, including individual sports like tennis and table tennis, badminton, golf, weightlifting, boxing. There were some cultural activities. There were participants in the Army Art Contest and playwriting contests. They had an orchestra, a choir, and a drum and bugle corps. And I should mention that the groups, individuals, and teams who participated in these activities did very well and brought many trophies and prizes and commendations for their activities and their successes. The activities of the special services included more than just setting up and coordinating these activities. It included planning graduations, performances, and decorating for one event or another. One significant action was to set up banking opportunities to Camp Savage and Fort Snelling. With little free time, opportunities to just do personal banking were difficult at best. After several inquiries, the First National Bank agreed to come to camp on a regular basis and provide banking services on site. When Governor Harold Stassen told Colonel Kai Rasmussen that he and the people of Minnesota would welcome the MISLS here, he was correct. Many families welcomed soldiers into their homes for home-cooked meals. Volunteers came out to help clean up the grounds, and there were many other offers of friendship and aid for the soldiers. And these were all coordinated by the special services. I was never able to bring myself to ask Dad whether he regretted not being part of being part of the linguists and being deployed. But in his papers, I found this commendation and he had marked this passage, so it was important to him. It was issued by Colonel E.K. Wright, Executive Director, through Colonel Kai Rasmussen, the Commandant. It read, "You sacrificed opportunities to join your comrades in combat zones and accepted your responsibility as a non-combatant, and the high morale of the men at the MIS language school was in no small degree due to your contribution as Special Services clerk." Dad was discharged from the Army as a tech sergeant in April of 1945. He reenlisted and moved with the school from Fort Snelling back to California to the Presidio at Monterey, where he was discharged in October of 1947. He, Mom, and 2 children moved back to Minnesota, where Dad completed a Bachelor of Arts degree at MCAD, the Minnesota College of Art and Design, under the GI Bill. Dad, Mom, and 5 children remained in Minnesota. I felt I should share with you that he felt his experiences following Executive Order 9066 and the incarceration were at least partially responsible for his active participation in social justice and human rights initiatives after discharge from the Army and completion of his education under the GI Bill. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Peggy. And thank you to all of our panelists for sharing the stories of your fathers. A personal thank you to all as well for supporting the work that we do at Fort Snelling, and for supporting my personal research and writing articles. And whenever I ask you for feedback or photographs or more information, you're always there to help us. So thank you so much. I do have just a couple of questions for our panelists. If you would like to come up and join me, you could. Thank you. I'll start with a few questions for our panelists, and then we can take a couple of questions from the audience as well. My first question is directed more for Matt Abe, but if others want to add to it, feel free. So Matt, why do you feel that it is important for people today to know the history of the Military Intelligence Service Language School?
Thanks, Kimmy. I think that days like today and efforts to preserve the history of the MISLS in particular are very important, because without reflecting on our history, the history is in jeopardy of being forgotten. But one of the things that I really have been encouraged by is, Kimmy, your work and the work of the Historic Society, and just recently I've learned of all the great materials that are at the Savage Public Library that are preserving these stories that are very important for a couple of reasons. Number one, because it was a secret. It was actually classified for decades after World War II ended, that nobody could talk about it. And so that history was in great danger of being lost. I think what my dad would say is the reason that it's important that we talk about this history and preserve it for future generations is that there's a very important lesson to be learned about the Japanese-American experience. And that is, even though that the Japanese were incarcerated and interned en masse after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese people, and particularly the Japanese Americans who were born in the United States, believed very much in this country and in our Constitution and in the whole idea of America. And they believed in it so much that many of them left the camps to serve in the military and fight for this country. And some of them were, like my dad, were already in the military, but they decided to stay in face of, some harsh treatment at times and a lot of personal conflict. But they decided that, they remembered the words of their parents saying that, hey, you guys are Americans. We came here from Japan a long time ago, but you guys are Americans, and that's where your heart should be. And I think that's just an incredible story, and it needs to be preserved.
Thank you, Matt. Did Karen or Peggy, did you want to add anything? Matt put it pretty well.
Yeah, I think Matt said it pretty well. My dad's story was very similar. But his father always emphasized, this is your country. Mm-hmm. Never do anything to bring shame to your name. Serve your country with honor.
Thank you. I have another question, and I think it's best directed at Karen. What surprised you the most about your father's story?
One of the things that I actually was relieved to discover was that the Nisei linguists in the South Pacific were told not to use torture as a means of extracting information. And in fact, my dad relayed a story about one U.S. Air Force captain who slapped a prisoner and got reprimanded for it. So my dad and the Nisei linguists, they used their knowledge of Japanese culture and psychology and history, and they understood that the Japanese soldier was indoctrinated and trained that you die fighting. You never allow yourself to be captured. And if you are captured, that's a fate worse than death. It's a dishonor worse than death. And as a result, when they did get a prisoner, that prisoner had no training in what to do in case they ever got captured. So, our soldiers, it was like, oh, name, rank, serial number, you know your rights. They knew nothing. And my dad said these guys were wounded and starving, and you'd go up to them, and first of all, they'd feel they were startled to see someone with a Japanese face who spoke their language, and then you would offer them a cigarette or a piece of candy. And because most of them were farmers, you'd ask them, well, who's harvesting your crops at home? And he said once you got them there, it was hardly a prisoner that you could not, get whatever information you needed from them. It was very different than what it was on the European front. But again, that understanding of the culture and the psychology of the people really aided them in obtaining what they needed.
Thank you, Karen. I have just one last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. For Peggy, how do you think that the wartime experience of your father affect what he did in his life? And furthermore, how did it affect your life?
Well, as I mentioned in my presentation, Dad felt that he became very active in social justice and human rights initiatives. As far as advocacy, he traveled to Milwaukee to march with Father Grappe for fair housing for blacks. And even though he was a veteran, he was opposed to the Vietnam War and traveled to Washington, D.C. to protest. And he also went with a delegation to France to try to talk with the Vietnamese delegation there to find a proposal for a peaceful resolution to the war there. He was involved in a lot of advocacy activities with the JACL, and he wrote lots of letters and did some presentations and things. But one of them was for redress to provide some remuneration for the people who were taken from their lands and lost everything and were incarcerated in the camps. And then later, also for the repeal of the Title II, the Internal Security Act of 1950, the Emergency Detention Act, which allowed American citizens to be imprisoned without designation, without cause. So those were a couple of things. He was also very interested in education. He gave over 200 talks around the state of Minnesota as part of what would now be called diversity training to teachers, as well as to other interested groups on the incarceration of the Japanese, and to try to impress upon people that it should never happen again. He sat on a number of education boards and committees to establish Asian studies and equal education opportunities for everyone through the U of M, the JACL, local schools, and his church. We talked about this Minnesota Nikkei Project, which was a nonprofit organization that provided help and service to senior Japanese. And as far as for myself, I would say that I'm not as outgoing as my father, but I have joined the JCL Education Committee, and here I am. And and I've tried to do little advocacy things on my own. So.
Thank you so much, Peggy. Now we can take some questions from the audience, and I have Annie Johnson helping us with a microphone, and Jacob as well. So
we have is this on? We have two questions. Can you speak to what the role of the Women's Army Corps, and what kind of activities they were engaged in?
I have a second question, too. We've heard about the fathers. I was just wondering what your impressions is if you had any impressions for how the grandparents, your grandparents might have survived the internment camps and what they did, how they did after the war.
Well, I'll take a stab. I don't know a lot about the WACs. I know they did have a class that trained at Fort Snelling. And, you know, I mean, the women were just as accomplished linguists as the men. They were trained, I think, the same curriculum, and the only thing, I'm not sure that they ever actually did interrogation. But other than that, there was some difficulty, you know, back in those days. Of course, you know, a lot of the families didn't want their daughters to go into the military, and there was an attitude, you know, in the men's army about having women, and I believe there was a little bit of difficulty when that class from Snelling arrived in Japan to join MacArthur's unit there, that they didn't want the women. And so they actually ended up having to resign their military positions and re-sign up as civilians. And they served in Japan in the occupation, but as civilians who'd been trained as military WACs. Oh, the second question, there, you know, and again, I'm sure we can all speak to this. Both my mother's family and my father's family were imprisoned in Poston. And I know that when my father's family, my father actually got so fed up that in, I think it was 1944, he decided he was going to go back to Japan, and he applied to be sent back to Japan. My dad was aghast at this, and he did everything he could to intervene with the State Department and the embassies and everything. And he ended up getting my grandfather's application stalled. And thank God, because I wouldn't be here right now if that hadn't happened. And the family would have been split up. Half the family would have ended up in Japan, and the older kids would have ended up staying in the States. But my grandfather was one of the last to leave Poston because he was 62 years old when people were let out of the camps. He had no money, he had no house, he had no job, he had absolutely nothing but the $25 that they gave him for a train ticket to someplace. And, you know, he ended up, there was a 2-bedroom government housing that a friend was living in with his family of 8, and they offered my grandfather with his remaining family of 5 to join them. So with 13 people living in a 2-bedroom house. And then he got a job at 62 where he would go take the train into Los Angeles after midnight when the bars were closed, and he would clean bars at night. So that's how he kind of got started getting back on his feet. By then his kids were getting old enough, and they started sending money home to try to support the rest of the family.
Well, my grandmother on my mother's side was at Tule Lake, and Tule Lake later became sort of a place that they put what they considered dissidents of, and it became really quite a horrible place to be. But they moved the people who were actually there to another camp. But it was interesting. My grandmother ran a restaurant, and she helped her husband run a hotel. And on the list of things that they said that she could do if she came out was to be a domestic. So she actually took a position at a hospital in Rockford, Illinois, and moved there, and sewed clothes and ironed sheets and whatever there, but she made a lot of good friends there. And so they made their way as my grandfather on my father's side now was a little older, and he went to live with my dad's brother, and he lived out his life with them. But he never was able to get another job after leaving the farm.
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for sharing this and for the good work you've done to prepare this information. It's so important to hear and really valuable to hear. I'm curious, how did the curriculum come to be at the beginning, and did it evolve over the time that the school was active?
Well, my understanding of the curriculum, there were, in this country, like at UC Berkeley and Harvard and, places, they did have schools where they taught the Japanese language. But they were cultural. They were like people who were studying art and literature. And those professors did not want to tailor their curriculum to military language. And so, but they did use a curriculum that was developed, I think, in the Berkeley area, just the basic language curriculum. But, these guys had to have had some exposure growing up, with their parents speaking the language, so that they didn't have to start from ground zero. There was another, I think it was kind of interesting, there was another school, an Army language school that was meant for Caucasian, for white people, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And because there was rare, you could count them on one or two hands, the number of Caucasian people in this country were proficient in Japanese. And a lot of them had been raised in missionary families in Japan. But they established a military language school in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. And they picked people who were judged intellectually very bright, Phi Beta Kappa, with something in their background that made them language, more apt to be able to learn language easy. But those guys had to go to that Ann Arbor language school for a year. And then after a year in Ann Arbor, then they went to Camp Savage. Oh. So it took them a while. I mean, it really slowed down. And then they weren't soldiers. They had to go through another 2-3 months of basic training after that. So quite a bottleneck.
And also I've read that the education sort of evolved as things were going on over in the Pacific. They would relay those things back, things they had learned about the people and the area and what kind of language you needed, and that was fed back to the class. So the curriculum was always changing, depending on what they were learning as they were moving along. So it was an evolving education program.
Thank you also for me for this wonderful program. It's been very enlightening. My comment or questions relate to the classified nature of the camp at Savage. When I was growing up as a kid in the late 50s, early 60s, my family often went down there for picnics down at that facility. There were still concrete slabs, and there was a spring that still was pumping water out down there. And we were always told it was a internment camp. And I don't know if that was actually part of the cover. In looking at your presentations, I saw pictures of people standing in front of signs talk about going to downtown Minneapolis on furloughs. So I'm not quite sure how confidential it was at the time, but it certainly, growing up in the 60s, that's the stories that we had.
Yeah, I've heard that too, even from, peers now, that they had assumed it was either a prisoner of war camp or a internment camp. Yeah. But I think, some people must have known. I don't think they could have kept it totally secret.
My dad said that whenever he was questioned, he would kind of preface it by saying that we really can't tell you a lot about the camp, but that they were U.S. soldiers. He did say that because it was wartime, they were pretty much always in uniform. And so people would ask them, it was obvious they were associated with the military somehow, and he would say, yes, we're with the U.S. Army, we're American soldiers, but we're not allowed to give you too many details about what we're doing in camp. And it was wartime, so I think people accepted that.
I think, many of us as children of these men didn't know either, because
Right.
they kept their secrets, even though after 1973, I think that it was declassified. Many of them never spoke about what they did in detail because they felt that they were breaking a confidence or something, that they were told not to say anything. Because even I had read that soldiers who actually were here with the MIS were then sent over to Europe, and the guys in Europe just thought they were sitting sort of twiddling their thumbs, translating a few things, but they never said anything, so they just had to take whatever. They thought they had cushy jobs, and they didn't. But they were very careful about that, and many of them took their stories to the death.
It was interesting, in the 1960s, I attended elementary school at a school that was, well, still is adjacent to the Presidio of Monterey, the Army Language School. And at the time, there was never any talk of the history of the Army Language School, probably for the reasons you talked about. I didn't realize even then that its predecessor here in Minnesota was classified. But I'm wondering, my question is, there's a lot of discussion about, recruiting students for the MILS, but I haven't heard anything about how they recruited and selected instructors, because I've talked to some of the panelists before about my father's cousin was an instructor at the school, and he was actually German. He grew up in Japan, and he moved to the United States before the war started, and somehow, and none of the family knows how, he ended up at the MILS, and eventually he ended up working for MacArthur in Japan. I just wonder if anybody in the research has run across how they selected instructors.
Well, I know ISO?
Yeah,
Yeah.
John ISO. The best linguists were actually what were called Kibei, and Kibei were American-born Nisei, second generation, whose families actually sent them back to Japan, and they did maybe completed part of school in Japan. And some of those Kibei were selected for the MISLS in San Francisco, where it first started. And a large portion of that first class, I don't know how many, were held back to become instructors for subsequent classes. So sometimes their best students were held back at the camp to be instructors for the next year. I think they went around, they did, tests like the Nisei soldiers that they had, and they found the people who were the most proficient, and they found this John Iso, who later became a judge in California. But John Iso evidently was quite good, but he was working in the motor pool. He was a private. And so when they recruited him for the school, when it started in San Francisco, he had to, resign his military position because it was always, there'd be some white soldiers under their, in their classes, and the soldiers would outrank the instructors. And so they had to teach as civilians. They couldn't teach as, captains or whatever, because they couldn't get the rank.
Bud's got a question.
With maybe Bud. Yeah.
This is a fine program. I really enjoyed it. I am a Nisei, second generation, and I've been here many years, as you well can see. But I want to say thank you very much to all you people who live here and primarily of Caucasian background, who have been so good to us. Absolutely great. We used to have difficulty in finding homes in areas, but we have many Caucasian people who have opened up the home, opened up the area for them to buy. I say thank you. This is great. I'm originally from Hawaii, and I went through Pearl Harbor, and they sent me up here for schooling. I'm a graduate of the Military Intelligence School. We closed up Fort Snelling. This was July of 1946. We moved the school cross country all the way to California, the city of Monterey, California. That's where I graduated. Then they sent us, who graduated, back to our homes. I was sent back to Hawaii for 2 weeks of vacation, furlough, and then we went on across the ocean to Japan, and I served under Walter Tanaka, then Lieutenant Tanaka, her dad. So all these pictures are very mindful of what happened. But I do want to say again, thank you very much, all of you who are from Minnesota, who have opened up your hearts to us. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you for that, Bud. And thank you to all of our panelists, again, for your presentations today, Peggy Doi, Karen Tanaka Lucas, and Matt Abe. I did want to end real quick by saying that we do have a lot of resources available to you if you want to learn more about this topic. The Twin Cities Japanese American Citizens League has a website. We do have an educational curriculum guide that's available. The densho.org has a lot of digital archives there. There is the Smithsonian traveling exhibit that is here, Righting a Wrong, it's called, and it is here until July 3rd, so check that out if you have the opportunity. Also, the Minnesota's Greatest Generation exhibit, which is on the same floor across the building, in this building, has a couple of panels about the language school. And in the bookstores, there is the Minnesota History Magazine. The sort of a shameless self-plug, I guess, because I did co-author the article with Krista Hansen. And Matt Abe was kind enough to help me, and Karen and Peggy as well. Your fathers are featured in the article. That is Toshio Abe on the cover of that magazine, and that's for sale at the bookstore as well. So, and thank you to the History Center for hosting us, and to Annie and Jacob for helping.